So much for joining us for the second part of the Valletta Tech Summit, the second and final day of this Tech Summit. I'm joined by 4 panelists now to discuss the legal and ethical implications of IoT applications. But before we start diving into the discussion and trying to understand what are the potential legal and ethical implications of IoT, I'd like to introduce you the panelists via this video. So once again, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jackie Malia, Dr. Paul Micallef-Grimaud, Dr. Antonio Guillo, and Dr. Ian Gauci. Possibly, Dr. Guillo, I'll start with you to set the tone and give us some context. What are the potential legal concerns when it comes to IoT?
Well, I think first of all we need to try to understand or define, even for the scope of the discussion, what IoT means. To set some boundaries. And I think the simplistic version would be that any kind of device which is connected to the internet or to a network now can be defined as an IoT device. Up until 10, 20 years ago, our experience with networks and with the internet was purely what we used to see from the screens of our computer, because the computer was our connection to the internet. Nowadays, the sky is the limit, and everything is connected with something which is bigger, with bigger opportunities, but also with bigger risks. If we had then to look at the legal and ethical implications of IoT as any kind of technology or any kind of human activity, something that is legal does not necessarily mean that it will be ethical for everyone. If we had to look at pornography, we can say some of it is legal, but whether it is ethical is something else. And with IoT devices, this distinction between legal, what is regulated by law, and what should one do or not do with that technology beyond what the law provides, is where the line should be drawn between the legal implications and the ethical implications. For sure, it will be, or it is easier to establish the legal boundaries, because that is done through legislation. When we're talking through ethical boundaries, something which is more subject to the culture, to the society you live in, etc., etc. However, ethics are also a very important ingredient in the formulation of laws. We build laws around us in order to regulate the way we live. And some cultures are more permissive than others. Other restrictive cultures will have more restrictive laws to reflect their level or their understanding of ethics. For sure, when we're talking about IoT, it's a constant rat race where the law needs to catch up with technology all the time. When it comes to the formulation of ethics, it's more coming from our tradition. So we are based, or we have a specific understanding of what our ethical norms are, and they take quite a long time to change. Then comes technology, and the legislator needs to rush to try and regulate through laws what this technology is bringing us. And therefore, there is quite this ongoing race on who comes first and how to do it.
So in essence, Dr. Micallef-Grimaud, are we saying here that IoT is regulated?
IoT is being regulated in different ways than we are used to possibly looking at implications of law. Let me just go maybe to the philosophy of law itself as in its essence. We are used to a law whereby laws are written, norms are there to follow, and it is intended to bring human actors, members of the society, to act in a way which conforms to the law. If you don't abide by the law, of course, then there are the repercussions that you need that you have to be subject to. In this particular aspect of technology, especially IoT, and even when it integrates even more with artificial intelligence, we are no longer speaking of only human actors, but actually we are speaking of devices, machines, computers, that are speaking to each other connecting to each other without a human interface or necessarily someone who is there directing this communication between the devices. And these devices are even taking actions autonomously. So to give maybe a real-life example, the Boeing 737 MAX incidents, which unfortunately we all know of. What happened there was that, for example, Boeing fitted machines, the fuel engines, which were heavier than the previous ones because they were better in terms of fuel consumption, which led to the airplanes having what they call an angle of attack, which means that the airplane will go up because of the weight. So in order to combat this, they inputted a software which would stabilize the airplane upon a trigger by a sensor reading on this angle of attack. What happened was that the sensor gave a wrong signal, and therefore the software kicked in, and the airplane would dive downwards. So what I just want to show here with this example is how more complex it is when we're looking at sort of the implications of law and the way we look at the regulation of technology. Now, sort of, even with that example, the solution found was through technology itself. So what they did is they inputted more than one sensor, and only if the two sensors had the same reading would then the software to stabilize the airplane kick in, and not just with one. And this is very much akin to what we see as sort of the drive in the regulation of technology, what we call by design and by default. So everything this is a very common terminology, whether we're speaking about privacy, whether we're speaking about security, whether we're speaking about cybersecurity, we're looking at an ex ante sort of form of looking at the risks that the technology has when you are implementing it in society. And then the obligation is to counter those risks by including immediately within the technology, or else with the processes surrounding the implementation of the technology, the necessary countermeasures to those risks.
So to touch on what Mr. Mikhailov Grimo, Dr. Mikhailov Grimo just mentioned, this tangible example, from your professional experience, Dr. Jackie Malia, what's your take on the issues of privacy, security that comes into the equation of using IoT?
Yes, well, I think I would boil them down into two very fundamental issues, which is, first of all, the security of the devices, of the apps and so on that are using this technology. So what we have seen, for example, is you have a situation where the technology is a bit vulnerable to attacks, and therefore perhaps it gets hacked. What's the result of that? You can have various situations. You can have, for example, you've got, for example, a watch. There was in fact a case where there was a kid's watch which was recalled from the market because they felt that the device was actually sort of pinpointing the location of these kids, and it was the app that went with it was not very secure. And so it was possible for an outsider to obviously hack into the system and get to know where these kids are, and obviously putting them at risk. So it's very much a sort of a security issue in that case. And you've got other examples like this. For example, these smart TVs that we have in our homes, it's possible to sort of hack them and hack the camera, hack the microphones, and obviously be able to sort of spy on people. I have a friend of mine, in fact, this weekend was spying on her kids at home through her speaker. So, it's possible. It's not very difficult to do this, you know what I mean? So, because the devices are connected, it is possible. The reality is, there are ways to misuse, basically, this technology. So obviously, although there are a lot of advantages and a lot of good things that come out of the advancement of technology, but then yes, one needs to kind of catch up to some extent with the regulations. The other issue with this kind of technology is data. And if you've got, for example, a Fitbit or whatever it is that you're using, any of these devices, if you've got something, if you have a smart fridge, if you have a smart TV, everything is giving information about you. So the people who are actually behind the technology can have a very, very detailed profile of you, of your interests, of your habits, of your health, which is a very sensitive area, for example, of data. And therefore, this is another issue, you know. I mean, to what extent does the law protect the privacy of those individuals that are using this technology and, you know, perhaps not even aware of the fact that they are giving up so much information about themselves? So I think in a nutshell, those would be sort of the two main regulatory issues that one would need to address.
Definitely Dr. Guillot might be interested in sharing some insights into also GDPR there, but possibly yes. I'd like to, I don't know if you want to just jump into it straight away.
No, I think the reality is that a number of principles, you know, that we need to have our data secure, that we need to be the owners of our own information. Those are all principles which are quite established at law. There is a long history of data privacy legislation, well before the advent of Google, well before the advent of the World Wide Web, so on and so forth, which said basically the commandments of how we should act. What technology brings to the table, however, is various new ways in which this data is processed and our lives are shaped. And IoT is also part of that picture. So it's not just looking at the technology itself or the device or the item which we have in front of us or the product, whether it's a smartwatch, whether it is a pacemaker, whether it is a refrigerator, etc., but what we're doing with it. So we will need to look at the vertical business case of where the technology is being used, and that is where the problem starts arising. As technology lawyers, we always look or discuss or debate the concept of technological neutrality in law. So you have a law which is completely neutral, or as neutral as it can be when it comes to the regulation of the technology itself. I'm regulating the activity, the action, but I'm not regulating or I'm not looking at the technology. However, you know, when we look at the rise of biometrics, the rise of connected devices, etc., we couldn't just remain completely blind and say, you know, we have to have the 10 commandments without any kind of specific reference to the underlying technology. Some form of intervention had to be made. Even as little as that intervention is, it still makes a big difference. So again, if you were to ask me whether IoT will completely change or rehash the legal landscape, the answer will be no. But there will need to be adjustments and an understanding of how current principles or current rules also apply in these kind of scenarios.
So Dr. Guillot just said you're all technology lawyers, if I may use that term. But you, Dr. Gauci, you're focusing primarily on IoT. My question is to add on what Dr. Guillot just said is possibly there was this rush to use IoT technology, and possibly this rush outpaced the creation and implementation of certain protocol standards to safeguard privacy and security measures. What's your take on that?
I'd like to hone a little bit back before I answer that,
sure,
and touch upon what my colleagues just discussed. Whereas it's true, we don't have a common definition of IoT, okay? But we all know what IoT is, and I agree with Antonio's take that anything which is connected to the internet. But that there we're speaking about different supply lines. We're speaking about different sectors. So there it becomes problematic as well. IoT is heavily regulated already. But in different sectors, you have different kinds of legislation, whether it is ex ante, ex post. We're speaking about something. So from the technical point of view, IoT, you have the mixing up of software, hardware, and sensors. So usually that is IoT, okay? Even there, software to a certain extent is regulated depending on the industry. Hardware is regulating depending on the industry. And usually as well, the sensor components, data protection, blah, 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 and all the rest, it is regulated as well. So when you try to tap into your IoT, try to define it, okay, you try to find common elements, common problems. For example, a common element would be that you need to have connectivity for it to be on the internet, and then you verge on electronic communications, which is already regulated. So a mobile can be an IoT, but a mobile as a terminal device depends on electronic communications, which is regulated. We look at 5G toolbox. So anything which is IoT is connected to the internet, it forms part of what we call 5G. That is not only regulated, but there is a specific toolbox of what can be commercialized within the EU. 5G toolbox. So there it becomes a little bit complex. So let's hone, however, on the legislation. So I said before, it is regulated. You might tell me where. It is regulated depending on the industry. If you have a medical device, which is an IoT, you have the medical devices regulation. If you have a car, it's connected. If you have electronic communications, it's regulated. But it's still problematic. If you have data protection by design. Before it was privacy by design. Now it's data protection by design. But it's still lacking. It is lacking to the extent that even from a data protection point of view, when the legislator recently, months back, tried to regulate IoT to make it safe, we're speaking about safe toys here, even toys can be IoT, they did not use, and on data protection, they did not use the GDPR, they did not use data protection by design, they amended the radio directive, they made sure that every IoT device, okay, for it to be available in the European market, it needs to follow privacy by design principle, not even directing or pointing to GDPR. So even there, on data protection, we're seeing that the same will happen with AI. So you either follow these rules, and it is certified CE and all the rest, otherwise you cannot commercialize it within the European Union because of safety features, because the jeopardy there is great. But even there we have a limitation. And this is where I think we need to amplify a little bit. We're speaking about data, as much as we're speaking about security. Data protection covers only personal data. Here we're speaking about other forms of data. Here we're speaking about data which is intrinsic to the online environment. It is intrinsic for the operation of IoT. It is intrinsic for AI, which will function with IoT. We're speaking about, we call it CIA. So there we're speaking about security of that data. What is CIA? You have confidentiality issues, it's not tied with data protection. Integrity. Okay? You have integrity and you have accessibility. That is something tied with data which is not personal data. There we have a big lacuna, massive lacuna. As a matter of fact, even existing legislation is trying to cater for that. Passportability of that data, because we have passportability of personal data, not that type of data, machine readable data, machine originated data. So that needs to be catered for, and but we have another problem, and I will close with this. Okay? We have a dimension where, irrespective of these issues, we have the security element. Security is larger, okay, to a certain extent than data protection, than the elements of data, because security includes these issues. However, it's larger, and there are existing standards, depending on the sector where you're operating. There's Senelec, there's the ISO 27000 family, 27001, 31, 33, 35, which are generalistic. There are different standards, so there we have a problem as well. We have a legislation which is trying now as well to harmonize those standards, but it is exposed, not ex ante, and it is voluntary. It's the Cybersecurity Act, which is as well applicable now in legislation. They're going to have cybersecurity certification regimes applicable for IoT. You have cloud, okay? You might have IoT in the future. You have SOC-based, which is predominantly based on cybersecurity elements. However, it is exposed. So what happens in these instances, similar to data protection, is that unless there is an ex-ante measure, which my colleagues mentioned, unless there is an ex-ante measure which blocks an IoT, however we define it, okay, on a generalistic plane, from accessing the European market, blocks it, does not allow it, and then you stop it after, blocks it, there will be prejudice. And that is why specifically legislation is being touted here, similar to what the UK have. Germany is following suit as well. So the UK has a legislation where any IoT needs to follow security principles, privacy principles. Unless they meet those requirements, they cannot be marketed in the UK. So here we're taking the dimension of legislation a little bit forward. You might tell me, listen, but you have consumer legislation, isn't that enough? No. Time and time again, consumer legislation has proved itself not to be adequate for certain instances, particularly when you're speaking about, I prefer to use innovation rather than technology, and I think my colleagues will agree. Because technology, to a certain extent, even inventing the wheel, inventing fire, that's technology. Here we're speaking about innovation. And innovation, and I concur perfectly with my colleagues, it's very difficult to tap. It's very difficult to regulate. It's very difficult to harness its potential whilst at the same time balancing out the interest and mitigating the prejudice of the users. Why? Because when a legislator, and you're lucky because all of us used to work with the regulators here, all of us, directly and indirectly. When you try to implement a policy on a forward-looking plane, you need to anticipate. Here it's very difficult to anticipate. Very difficult to anticipate, added to the fact that, as Antonio correctly stated, and this applies in all facets of the industry, whether it's financial services, the medical device, in all facets of the industry, usually legislation, policy, regulation, it's always 4 or 5, now we're sometimes even 10 steps behind the actual developments in innovation.
Sure.
Something on what Ian said, because we can mention a lot of laws, a lot of rules, etc., etc. But when it comes to innovation, one of the biggest risks of legislation and innovation is that with too much regulation, you're stifling innovation. So there's always another side of the proverbial coin which we need to address. We have faced a number of experiences in the past in other sectors where a lot of initial regulation to try and mold somehow where the technology or the innovation is going was actually working in reverse. Mm-hmm. So it's always a very fine line to balance having proper regulation and proper checks and balances against heavy-handed regulation which will stifle innovation. Just one example. As Ian said, we're not only looking at one law called the IoT law, which will set everything, because IoT is everywhere, okay? So we need to see its application in cars. So we have the Car Safety Directive. If the car is an intelligent connected car, it still needs to be safe, irrespective whether it's connected to the network or not. So we don't have one single law which we can say, okay, if you want to know everything about IoT, you just need to read that. So that's already one of the considerations to keep in mind. But to achieve this security and to make sure that our consumers are safe, our kids are safe, etc., etc., it's not just a question of having a law in place, because it will have direct effects on the industry and on those sectors, again, using the example of a car. We don't have in Malta specific laws yet relating to driverless vehicles, okay? And that is both a risk and it could also be an opportunity. If you have, or if we want to look at establishing Malta as a place where these operators or these producers want to try out their systems, their products, we need to give them a landscape where they feel free that, yes, this is new, and give them the sufficient space or landscape where they can test them out in a legal way. And I think that is, again, a challenge which we will be facing more and more in the coming months and years ahead.
That's great.
Sorry. Go ahead. I mean, to pick up on what Antonio said, I agree to a certain extent, because I also do believe, however, that regulation is important for innovation because, first of all, it gives, for example, let's say the fact that there's data protection, that would give, if you know that a device or a technology is following those principles, it gives the consumer more confidence to use, more trust, in that product potentially, and therefore the uptake of that product is going to be more likely. Secondly, and as Ian was mentioning as well, the fact that there's a patchwork of laws, and the fact that each sort of country is regulating in a different way. That is a problem in itself, in the absence of harmonization, you end up with sort of legal uncertainty. So if, for example, you've got a product which you're developing and you're developing it in one country, but you can't be 100% sure that, you are going to be able to sell this product in another country because, and then, how are you going to comply with all the different laws? And, so that is why harmonization is a very important thing. Also because, for example, as an investor who might be interested in investing in the product, they obviously want to have all the certainty that they can possibly have, So if there isn't enough regulation to, where that for sure this product is going to go onto the market, it's not going to be recalled, and you want to know, that your investment is secure, then obviously a level of regulation of legal certainty needs to be in place. So, yes, a balance somehow, not too much, not too heavy-handed to stifle, but at the same time, not leaving it free for all, because then that obviously is going to create sort of this situation where nobody really knows exactly what they're supposed to be following. And maybe one more point that I would add is, the reason as well that law kind of tends to be a little bit slow in catching up is because the legal process in itself is very complex. Even to enact a law, it's not so easy. So when it comes to technology, we have seen that a lot of the way that sort of one regulates tends to be more on guidelines and technical sort of specifications. So you would have, say, international bodies, as we were mentioning, that would try to put certain technical specifications in place, and therefore you achieve a level of harmonization in that sense. And then obviously guidelines, technical specifications are much easier to amend than a law. So I think we've seen that there's more movement in the sort of guidelines and technical specifications area rather than the actual laws themselves.
On this aspect of harmonization, if I can just latch on. In fact, this is precisely what the Commission, as we've seen over the past few months, has been really pushing in this field. These few months were very active. We've seen in January the report, the final, so the end of a study which the Commission had gone into over the past 2 years with respect to those competitive restraints to the IoT sector itself. And here the Commission singled out data, the control over data as being, of course, data being sort of the new oil, so to say, of the industry. But at the same time, if someone or a few dominant players have control over that data, then that in itself could be a way to stifle competition. And in fact, in this study, which was issued in January, the Commission singled out the operating systems as being a possible restraint of competition, because Apple, Google, and Amazon for the voice operating systems are the three systems that all the IoT operators are using and have to use. And therefore, by using these systems, the systems themselves are collecting loads of data, more than they were already collecting. And if there aren't restraints put in place, all this data which is being collected by these operating systems can be used by these companies to then leverage their dominance in other vertical markets, and then offer services competing with those companies that are using their services. And that will continue to sort of grow the dominance of these three major players and drive competition out. And as a result of, not as a result of the study, but very close to the publication of the study, we've seen, in fact, the draft Digital Markets Act being published, where although the slant was a bit different, it was looking at the marketplaces on the internet and the dominance in those marketplaces, but still there is an effect there on the use that one can make of data collected in for one particular service being leveraged into another service. And also the Data Act, which is a new now proposal being pushed by the Commission, which is not a personal data, now GDPR, but it relates to the possibility that companies and individuals, but even companies themselves that produce data through the use of IoT, have the ability to request to have control over that data, so that they then can make use of that data to be more efficient. So this is a new trend which we are seeing being pushed out by the Commission. Will probably be in effect if we see this in around 2 years' time, if we see the full length of the process, which will continue to give greater advantage to those making the users of IoT and technology, to then, with the data that they themselves are producing, be able to be more efficient and have better products and services to offer on the market. And that is another slant to data apart from GDPR, which we already mentioned.
Sure.
If I may add something. So here we're taking the slant, and I think it's clear that we're speaking about a regulation usually caters for a scenario. It caters for a need. Now, here we need to start with the starting point that we are part of a European dimension. So there is a single European market. As a single European market, to a certain extent, we are net beneficiaries of certain technology. When we speak about AI, even when we started discussing, when we started commenting on the legislation, we're sort of not regulating AI providers within the EU because we are net beneficiaries. Similarly, with regards to IoT, to a certain extent, even though you still have the Ericsson of this world, okay, the Nokia of this world, even though they have foreign interests, but we're still net beneficiaries to a certain extent. A similar thing happened with regards to Information Society Service. Now we're calling them DSA, we have the DMA, which is the new dimension, digital governance. But the problematic is that the existing laws, even GDPR, as a matter of fact, yes, they are imposing fines. But respectively, the data of the European users, their profile, is harvested outside of the EU. These people have deep pockets. So that is why there was this slant for this regulation. IoT is similar. Because IoT is not only the device, which is a component, the car, it's also the platform on which you connect. So the device can be in Europe, can be provided by a European supplier, by a non-European supplier, okay? The actual platform can be outside of Europe. As we said before, it's not only data protection. Data protection there, the GDPR, it was a fantastic piece of legislation, but we're seeing that certain tweaks, as I mentioned before, even here the amended radio directive, they did not use data protection by design, but it applies as well for IoT. We're seeing it as well in AI. So if you see that there's harm, if you want to control, if you want to as well stabilize the European market, so there you need to harmonize. That is a very positive ambit. You do an impact assessment. You make sure that as much as possible, member states don't have the latitude so that you don't have regulatory shopping. Because usually clients hop from one place to another, so that needs to be harmonized as well. You make sure that innovation applies across the board, because we're part of one single European market. But it's important that you make sure as well that what is heinous, what jeopardizes the single European market and the user is blocked a priori, so there is ex-ante regulation. And that is problematic. And we've seen this. The only instances I saw this where, to a certain extent, Europe had to implement certain measures which are still based on the discretion of member states is with regard to 5G. When we had similarly the Chinese provider, so Huawei and all the rest, so they had reasons to believe that the Chinese government could be behind them. I mean, there needs to be a certain level, so they invented the 5G toolbox. There needs to be a certain level of checks and balances before, but they left it up to the member states. And we have this scenario what we have today. That will affect, so if that is not harmonized within IoT, within Industry 4.0, we're speaking about something, as Antonio said before, everything is going to be ubiquitous. So you have your fridge, your television, your car, you're practically part, even yourself, particularly now with metaverse, augmented reality, of an augmented platform, okay? But if you don't have these standards in place, so their legislation, regulation needs to be forward-looking, you're going to lack on one integral element, aside from security, interconnectivity. You cannot communicate, you cannot have ubiquitousness between people, between states, between different facets of business, if you don't have that, and that requires harmonization. So regulation, if it has the right focus, if it has the right dimension, if it has the right, and we use it a lot, but it's not easy to define, a right forward-looking landscape can cater for these scenarios with the baseline that sometimes even though we're catering for 24 months time, 18 to 24, that is the, in this sector, 18 to 24 months time, we've seen iterations of legislation which is still being cooked, You have one version that passes to trilogue. When it is in trilogue, you have the European Parliament, European Commission. They will discuss, okay? It's between three parties. The legislation is completely different. So it's a very difficult ball game. But at the end of the day, here what we're seeing is we need new forms of regulation. The existing regulation is good. It served as a very good stepping stone, but we're evolving. Society is evolving. So we need to cater for this new scenario.
My question is why you mentioned earlier UK seems to be
UK
So
were
why
the
the
first
EU is
ones.
following?
So UK were the first ones, but I believe that UK has always been on the forefront. Telecommunications, certain types of legislation, even when they were the EU, they used to draft their first pieces of legislation, usually as well taking a lot from the American continent, and the EU would follow. But in this instance, UK was mindful of the fact that they were going out from the EU, and they wanted to nurture their own market. And they were the first to tout an IoT legislation based on security principle, based on market principles as well, what can enter into the UK. Germany is following suit. The EU issued an initial draft as well on IoT, but as we said before, the problematic was that when there was this draft, they realized that it is going to cut across different sectors, different forms of regulation, so it was going to be a total mayhem. Literally, a total mayhem, aside then from the fact that you might have import legislation. It's not only technology, it's vaster. So they parked it a little bit. And at that time, we had the Cybersecurity Act. I think if I had to follow the ether of Dr. Guillo, because we spare a lot on it, if the Cybersecurity Act, and it has the function to be mandatory, I think that with that caveat and with the IoT certification being brought forward, because there's a process, okay? For the time being, we can stop the gap. But regrettably, for the time being, not only do we not have an IoT standard, not only do we not have accreditations mechanism on which to take the standard, okay, but the system is voluntary. And we still have, we still have a fragmented landscape, because for the time being, until this standard is out, every member state is still using its own, irrespective of the fact that myself and Paul has passed through these pains, that you should pass it through an ESA, there's a particular phase. So it is a little bit complex, but the direction is going to be there, it's clear. The EU is clear, they want to, Jackie nailed it, they want to harmonize, as Paul said, they want to harmonize, they want to make sure that as much as possible, the environment for Industry 4.0 is safe, and that carries a lot of corollaries with it. It will take time. It will take time, but we're going there. And what we have now as legislation is going to be the foundation stone for I would say, then legislation 5.0 to come.
That's a good one.
We might be too old, but...
No, but what Dr. Maria mentioned earlier, she mentioned vulnerable people, citizens, but what I'm sensing is even the system itself, it is vulnerable.
Yes,
Exactly.
very much
The system
so.
itself.
If I can add something, because we've been here before, and we've been here even when the internet was being launched. At the time, people were saying, but do we need a law for the internet? You know, there was this huge debate, do we need the law of the horse? You know, that was the example. You know, we have horses, you know, you don't regulate the horse, you regulate when the horse is actually in the street or whatever. And the same kind of philosophy tries to be applied to the internet. What we saw, however, that the World Wide Web turned into the Wild Wild West, okay? And things that the legislators or governments couldn't imagine that could be done with technology and the internet, in that case, had to be regulated. So I agree with Ian there that IoT will need to be regulated. I think the trick is how. And also this race between legal and ethics, etc., etc. We can regulate websites, we did, but nobody saw the explosion of social media, you know, before it actually happened. And that meant, you know, that new issues had to be regulated and seriously discussed. I don't know, hate speech, you know, the fact that our kids are addicted, you know, to connectivity. We didn't see that coming. So we can speak here till kingdom come, you know, trying to foresee the future and trying to have this,
But
this
to start with,
crystal
Dr.
ball.
Guillo, if I may, because being a GDPR expert yourself, for instance, should we strengthen GDPR?
I think it is an ongoing process. I think the shift or the jump between the Data Protection Directive of 1995 and the General Data Protection Regulation of 2018, was a reflection of the evolution of the processing of data, obviously mostly based on technology and new technologies. But I think if we had to look at the initial drafts of data privacy laws in the 1950s, also in the UK, and the GDPR, through Convention 108 of the Council of Europe, through the Directive of 1990, the general principles, the 10 Commandments, almost remained unchanged. It's more of a question of how to apply those commandments, okay? Your data has to be secure, your data is your own, you control it, with respect to these new instances of technology. So I think that is the trick. It's not a question of revising the principles themselves, okay? A car has to be safe, we agree. But if we put in IoT into the mix, okay, how can we ensure that the car remains safe? Is it a question of changing the principle or changing the standards, the technical standards, which definitely would impose whether that device will meet that security standard? So it's not a question of changing the 10 Commandments, or there's almost proverbially set in stone, but making sure that the technical standards, and this is where the advantage is, because when we're talking about technical standards, we're not talking about lawyers, we're not talking about legislators, we're talking about technical specialists who know their stuff, and not just a question of writing the rule, okay? It will definitely be an ongoing process, and it will never end. It could very well be the case that in a couple of years' time, after we see the actual impact of these technologies, and we see that our ethical philosophies might have changed, we might need to include a new rule or include a new commandment. But it's still too early. We're still in almost testing phase.
Yeah, because there's a lot of the tech frenzy surrounding IoT. It's still in its infancy by me.
It's not only tech frenzy though, because when GDPR started, Europe there was on the forefront. Now if you look at the data protection landscape worldwide, you have India, you have America, which is fragmented, but different states are issuing their own legislation. UK has recently announced that they are going to abandon GDPR. They were going to have, so even there, the GDPR will take a different dimension, particularly reflecting this new scenario, which includes IoT. But data protection in the electronic communication sector was not the direct remit of the 9546, which is the previous. There we had the 96.7, the privacy directive, 20258. Now we're going to have the privacy regulation. So even there, certain principles will remain the same, but we're going to have new principles. Remember what Paul mentioned before. When you have automation and autonomy, which are different. You can automate a process, but when you have autonomy, it's not automating the process, it's somebody taking the decision on his own, okay? Now, whether it is backed by, but taking the decision on his own. That could change as well the principle, the concept of what a controller is within such Industry 4.0 or mesh network. So the same principles will remain, but we need to evolve. Even the principle of personal data. It is one of the most open but flimsy terms in data protection. Why? Because it is subject to interpretation. Always. When you have now AI, when you have quantum computer, even the definition of personal data from data which is not personal, attributable to your activity within Industry 4.0 is going to radically change that. But yes, GDPR is the starting point as much as you had the Convention 108, which was the starting point, as much as we had the 90. It's a constant evolution. But you can't evolve law-wise and technology-wise. You have to evolve, as we're discussing today. At the end of the day, behind a principle of legislation, behind a principle of policy, behind a principle of forward-looking, there needs to be a principle of innovation. There needs to be a principle of, as well, of entrepreneurship, and you bind together. It is that which offers the excellent bedrock for any piece of legislation, let's not call it regulation, or measure which is meant to cater for society, because when you're catering for society, Antonio nailed it, You might cater for society by saying, listen, I did an impact assessment. There is a risk, but the risk is not so high. So my risk as a policy implementer, as a policy formulator, before you give the law to an authority to implement, would be that I will over-regulate this when the risk is minimal and it is controllable because I might have 3 other legislations which I can use, and there I stifle innovation. So there, societal welfare will diminish. It's complex. Okay. But that is why the discussion is wider than lawyers, is wider than technology people, and everything needs to be captured within this Industry 4.0. Yes, yes, and good ones to draw, good ones as well.
I think one very important principle, obviously always when we're legislating, is always to hear out sort of the industry, you know, because I mean, one of the best tools of a regulator is consultation with industry, because yes, sometimes as regulators, you know, you tend to be, as Ian said, a little bit sort of prescriptive, you know, and you're sort of just one-track mind and thinking of one particular scenario. But then you need the practical feedback, you know, from the industry who's actually going to have to live with this regulation. And I think as lawyers, we always sort of a little bit, we're blamed for being a little bit impractical, you know. So it's always a bit of a challenge, both as regulators and as lawyers applying the law, to try to always find a bit of a practical slant, you know, to this law at the end of the day, because you cannot regulate like that in a vacuum, you know. You have to see how the law that you are planning to implement is going to impact basically those people who have to work with it. So I think this is something that one needs to always keep in mind, you know, trying to balance the practicality of what you are trying to implement with yes, trying to regulate, and it's not an easy balance.
Balancing act.
And one definite point to make, maybe to conclude, is that definitely if there was need to emphasize that law is not a dead letter, is really in this area of technology, because law is being shaped almost by the technological
and that's why you're in
advancements.
it, because you know you have work for life, no?
And we're going to continue seeing these evolutions. We were speaking
Yeah,
in terms of AI. We're speaking about, for example, black boxes in AI, not knowing how the autonomous decision was taken, and therefore what data was used to make use of that, to come to that decision. In terms of DLT, we're seeing the lack of permanent, it's a permanent database of information. When in GDPR, you've got the right to erase data. So there's a conflict here which is arising because of technology, and therefore what we're going to be seeing definitely is much more development in terms of legal thought, how to regulate, to keep the principles which are obviously fundamental and pin down, I believe, the norms of society and the way the technology is binding society. And at the same time, how to make it work in view of these new developments in technology.
One last question, possibly related to what you're doing professionally. If you've come across any particular scenarios related to IoT use, possibly without sharing any confidential information, but possibly giving us some tangible examples.
Think we can go on the general as opposed to
Sure,
the personal,
absolutely.
because we had so many examples where the risks, you know, can be quite serious. You know, there have been tests that if you have a pacemaker which is connected to your phone, which is connected then to the hospital, so the surgeon can check how your heart is functioning and whether, you know, it should be speed up or less. Sure. And that system is hacked. Basically, you can murder an individual, you know, through the comfort of your office or through the comfort of your home by simply hacking the pacemaker. So there are serious risks.
Implications.
It's not just a question, oh gosh, I don't know whether the cycle of my dishwasher is ready because my IoT connected dishwasher lost connection to the internet. You know, those are things which are quite funny. But when you see that everything is connected, and again it also ties in with the importance of security. Without security, there is nothing. That's why regulating. So now we can debate on how and where, but the fact that there has to be regulation and these things needs to be properly controlled, you know, it's for the benefit of society in general. But again, if we are four lawyers here, we have four different opinions of how to get there.
I think
That's
we're
what
very
I said,
much- We're
honestly.
very much converging. On your last question, IoT, okay, to a certain extent, and I want to tackle a point which Antonio, in Malta we have a vehicle which can be used. We tried as well to open up spectrum because Malta is small, okay? And if you have a lot of spectrum which is a scarce resource which can be utilized for testing purposes, so spectrum is very important for our IoT, and that touches on a separate authority, okay? Spectrum numbering, there are specific number ranges as well for M2M communication, mobile to mobile, okay? Even specific SIM cards, data, but specifically on the activity IoT. So we have a specific sandbox. Myself and Paul have been working for the past now year or so on it, which is a technology neutral sandbox, okay? It's still not that crystallized, but it aims as well to cater for IoT as much as it will cater for AI, as much as it caters for DLT, as much as it caters for any software under the existing circumstances which might have a criticality in its use, okay? So that would capture all. We still need to refine, but we're already thinking about these things, so Malta there is at the forefront. You might tell me, listen, but no, it's not perfect, as much as it is not finite, as much as we don't know the boundaries between, for example, this technology sandbox with what the MFSA has, which is fintech, which might touch as well on IoT, okay? So, but it's works in progress. We're already there. I wanted to touch, however, on something which is a little bit tangential, because we're speaking here, when we speak about IoT, this new dimension, that touches as well, and Antonio here is an expert as well on cybercrime. When we touch that dimension, for example, when you have the powers of the police to enter into a place, to confiscate, you have a specific authority, ARB in our case in Malta, which has the powers to confiscate, okay? Even data, what is even there, the dimension of the existing legislation is Jurassic Park time. Sometimes you see things, for example, that the legislation, yes, you can access the computer and whatever is in the computer, you can take it. But within the dimension of everything being in the cloud and not in the computer, I mean, you can't touch anything. So even from this dimension, okay, even the versatility of IoT and everything can be IoT, in years to come, even your money can be IoT if it is part hard and part software enabled, which is on the net. So here we're seeing a dimension as well. It's not only actually regulating per se IoT, making sure that there are the required tests, which pen testing, blah, 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 and all that. No, but the whole dimension of our existence, even how police investigate, how police can access, what can be accessible, what kind of data, even the concept of evidence. So it is, I think you'll agree with, it is a totally different paradigm. I mean, you might tell me, okay, so are you anticipating all these? No, but it is something we're living in. So my experience right now has been specifically on these things. Okay. And it's amazing. You might say, listen, we have a roaming concept which can be applied. Sometimes you drag it too far. We can't apply it. We can't apply it.
One final dimension which I would add here in terms of sort of what we see in terms of law coming into play and which we haven't touched upon is intellectual property. Because of course, this is very much based on patents and copyright, speaking of software and of hardware. And when we're speaking about interoperability, there is going to be a need of standardization, much more standardization. And standardization brings with it also very close proximity, patents working, one might fall upon each other, and that could raise a number. And there's been, in fact, sort of one of the alerts here that in this area we could have a number of patent litigation that we will see happening. Because interoperability is requiring these systems to work together and therefore copying each other up to a certain extent.
Again, more work for lawyers. Yes.
It depends very much on the dates, on the sort of business case of the of that particular client, not specifically because they are IoT, but just, touching on so many different laws that actually
panel discussion we had so far during the Valletta Tech Summit, as expected actually.